business. I know Mike got my back. Skrilla on the track. ConventioNOT. What that means is unconventional. Been in the game of few, so comprehend what I'ma give to you. Cause in the instant you can turn your hustle to an institute. I can't stop, I'm on top because I'm conventioNOT. It's for the people like school teachers who think out the closet for causes that do reach us, and spark young engineers who interfere with what society's instilled in here. You keep me grounded, dog, and hold me down like my yogis that's hitting down with dog. Then it's back to business when I'm with my counterparts. No sitting down, so we walking around. Real talk, they talk about us, we the talk of the town. It's our chance, we contrast, but I ask that you pay attention while you listen to this podcast. I'm working with all I got, so when you see me, you know what I'm about.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining and welcome to the show. Today's guest, Jorden Rieke, is an ICU nurse, a PhD candidate, as well as one of the most dynamic younger guests that we've talked to. She's truly one of the people who are one of our listeners who reached out to schedule her episode, just like we asked time and time again. So we knew all of that about her before she joined. But what we really didn't know was the amount of passion that Jorden is able to motivate every single day. Passion for life, passion for family, passion for science, and passion for care. In this time when coronavirus has really put a hurt on the world, in America even more so, we're excited to welcome somebody like Jorden, who is not only an essential worker, but is essential to us surviving as a society. Buckle in, turn it up, and stick around. Today's guest, Jorden Rieke, Bionic Badass. Hey, Jorden.
Hello.
Hey, Chris.
Welcome
to conventioNOT.
Thank you.
Hey,
Happy to be joining you.
I think you're actually like one of our first guests who navigated us through like listenership. And so I know you and Chris know each other, but that's kind of exciting to me.
Yeah. No, I'm kind of working backwards, working through all the different episodes, and I've really been enjoying hearing you guys talk about random stuff from underwear to, more serious topics. But yeah, I actually no one even told me about it. I just kind of came across it and I saw a post. I think Chris, you might have posted something on Instagram or something like that. So I've been following along.
Well, we are glad to have you here. Jorden, I guess we should probably dive in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. We want to hear what your story is.
My story. Okay. So I am a nurse. I work in a cardiac ICU unit. I think that's probably the least interesting thing about me, though. Currently in grad school, studying really hard. I want to do research eventually, and I want to do research on type 1 diabetes, because probably the most interesting thing about me is that I have type 1 diabetes. And so, I do a lot with that also in my spare time. I would consider myself to be a diabetes advocate. I do a lot of work with, other companies, camps for children with diabetes, that sort of thing. So definitely keep myself busy. That's for sure.
Nice. And I think you also refer to yourself as a diabadass, right?
Diabadass for sure. Yeah. Or diabetes, whatever suits your fancy.
Okay. Well, we're about to go diabetes mode. And
okay.
I think it's really important to explain to the listeners exactly what type 1 diabetes is and how does that affect you?
Yeah, so it seems like a simple question, but to kind of accurately describe type 1 diabetes, it kind of requires a lot of context. But the simple answer is that it's an autoimmune disease. So my body, for whatever reason, they don't really know why, they don't quite understand this yet, but for people with type 1 diabetes, their bodies attack their pancreas, which is the organ that produces the hormone insulin. And the hormone insulin is what regulates your blood sugar. So type 1 diabetics, they have no insulin. Their body can therefore not regulate their blood sugar at all. And it's because it's an autoimmune disease. It's very different from, there's actually a lot of different types of diabetes, and most people don't know that. There's kind of a general consensus of what diabetes is based on what you see in like commercials for lots of different, pills and drugs that you see. But there's a lot of different types, and type 1 is actually, a rarer disease. So most people don't know about it.
I think we want to dive further into that a little bit, right? Like, so part of being a diabetes advocate, we were talking before we clicked record about some of that, like being part of my business. And, I'm almost embarrassed sometimes because of like the limited exposure that I get to patients, other than like, these groups that we pull together and all these kinds of things. But like, so help us understand a little bit, because I think almost everybody in their family has somebody that's affected by certainly type 2 diabetes, but there's also type 1, which is, as you classified, and I think increasingly classified as autoimmune deficiency, right? Or autoimmune disease of some sort. Help us understand.
Well, I think I think it would be helpful for people to kind of understand a little bit what the difference is for type 1 diabetics versus maybe a type 2 diabetic. And there are actually other, types, but that kind of probably is beyond the scope of this podcast. But, type 1 diabetics face very kind of specific and unique challenges because we are 100% dependent on what they call exogenous insulin, or insulin that I have to give myself from either a vial or, I use technology and insulin pump. And if I don't have access to that, it's not sustainable for life. So that's something that's unique to the disease, and it causes a lot of, I think, stressors for, my fellow type 1 diabetics. And it really is a self-managed disease. So there are a billion different things you have to think about all day long, every day, with no different, it never ends. So they really speak about, in the research in the diabetic community and the healthcare field, we're trying to understand more about the mental burden of the disease and how much we have to think, how much decision making we have to do each day, because it's self-managed by us day in and day out, 24/7. And I could really go into some specifics about how challenging that can be if you'd like. It really never stops. My brain is just it's just full all day long with things, someone without diabetes would never have to think about.
It feels like you have a stressful job, right? You're working in the ICU unit, and then you're also dealing with diabetes on top of that. I mean, do you just have days where you just feel just entirely burnt out?
Yeah. And that's a huge feeling that most people with type 1 diabetes feel, that feeling of burnt out. I actually just participated in a research study as a person with diabetes, talking about that. That was something they were trying to understand, is how much burnout we face and the kind of the psychological factors. It's kind of well established that people with type 1 diabetes are much more likely to develop, different health disparities and kind of mental, like depression, anxiety, things like that, because it can be very, burdensome to think of. And my job is very high stress. So there are often a lot of people who will just decide, I'm not going to take that type of job because it really is just so much to handle, managing this thing on top of, someone else's life. So I've had to get really creative and really crafty in my work and trying to make sure that I'm taking care of not only my patients and their families and keeping them alive, but remembering to also check up on myself. And that can be something that, is really difficult to balance. But I've taken a lot of efforts to really, focus on wellness, because I know, and anyone with this disease knows, that you can get burned out. And so I really put a lot of effort into reflecting on my wellness and my health and kind of being proactive with anything that I think will benefit it, to make sure that I just don't get there. I don't get to those burned out states. It's hard, but it's definitely, necessary to do, I would say.
So I almost always ask this question. And it seems like you're like early to mid-career. And so is there something like foundationally that one push you through like the type of education that it takes to be not only a nurse, right? So I think almost all of our listeners know, because we talk a bit about like, clinical education, but like not only a nurse, but the companion education it requires to work in it. Is it ICU or a pediatric ICU that you're in?
It's ICU. It's like a specialized cardiac ICU.
So were you always just balling out? Like, were you a nerd? You're like, hey, I just want to be a nurse because I work with this illness? Or like, was there something that you could tie back as a kid or as a young person that like pushed you that way to, because it sounds like you kind of got two careers going on, right? And I think a lot of people do, and it doesn't get looked at that way as somebody who's an advocate, right? Because they go to work and they work a tough job, like Chris just talked about, and then they go and they're an advocate. It's not like a side hustle where they make a bunch of money, but like it's something that they pour into. Why the hell do you do that? Why?
Well, what's funny is way back when I was in high school and you're kind of traditionally thinking about, okay, like what are the next steps for your life? I always knew that I wanted to be in healthcare for sure. I mean, ever since I was a little girl, something about the human body and like anatomy particularly really just was fascinating to me. So I always knew I wanted to be in healthcare. But when I was in high school, I thought that I wanted to be a doctor, and I thought that I wanted to, change people's lives by being a physician. And I have kind of always been obsessed with this idea of, creating your own path where one doesn't necessarily exist. And so I always thought, who would make the best doctor? The best doctor would be the person that was a nurse first, who learned how to really like care for the patient and not just treat them, and then become a doctor and then really have this like huge scope and know all of it and be able to connect with their patients on a different level. So I, entered in nursing school, and I first started doing like a pre-med track and a nursing track at the same time. And then quickly within the first year or two, actually realized, I actually kind of really like this nursing thing. I really liked the patient, aspect that you don't necessarily get as much with, maybe a doctor's visit where you see someone for 30 minutes. Your nurse, you spend your entire hospital stay with if you're inside the hospital. Mm-hmm. And so I really enjoy taking care of people and meeting people, and I'm a people person, I think. And so I ended up saying, well, I think I'm going to switch to nursing, but I still really loved all the kind of like nerdy technical, like research stuff about, the med school track. And so I decided, well, I think a good bridge would be maybe kind of sticking with the nursing, but instead, adding a research lens to that. And so I kind of had a little bit of experience because in high school I did a summer internship with one of the major medical centers around here, and where they kind of introduced high school kids to the concept of research. And I did a little bit of like data collection and stuff. So I kind of along the way, it started off and it morphed into something I didn't expect. And I actually didn't get diagnosed with diabetes until I was, just before I went to college. So I had already decided like, oh, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to do this. And then I got diabetes. So as I've been going through my track and I became a nurse, I've been always looking for ways to move it towards something I'm a little bit more passionate about. And, I love my job. I love cardiac. I love all of the things that it's taught me, which is why I took the job. But now I'm going to take those skills and transition, more towards diabetes, which is what I really, what I'm really focused on and interested in.
What's up, conventioNOT listener? Thanks for spending the time with Mike and I today. What we're really looking to do is to grow our listener base time and time again. We've been doing the show for quite some time now, and one of the things we've learned is that the people who listen to us are our best assets. They give us a good idea about what to talk about, who we might want to interview, and they tell others about the show. So if you dig it, don't keep it a secret. Get out on your review channel, tell a friend, or drop us an email and give us a suggestion about something you might like to hear about.
So you brought up something that you found out just before you went to college, right? You were diagnosed with diabetes. And I want to know, A, what was that initial feeling like for you? And then B, if we have any listeners listening right now and they just were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, what advice do you have for them?
Oof, tough ones. First, my diagnosis was a little bit interesting in that I think I was a little bit lucky because I already knew a little bit about it, having, an interest in medicine and stuff like that, and taking some classes and things. And so I knew something was up. I had a lot of really weird symptoms. I just was fatigued. I was thirsty as all get out. I was hungry. I lost like 30 pounds in the matter of a month or two. And I just was at a regular checkup with my doctor, and he, we did like a normal urine sample, and he was like, "You need to go to the hospital now." And,
Wow.
and my mom was like, "Is it that serious? Can we eat dinner?" And he's like, "Feed her dinner and then get to the hospital." And I, have always been kind of aware. So I knew she was trying to like keep me calm and not scare me. And she was not scared at all, or she probably was, but she didn't show it. And so, that made me feel a lot better, and it made me not be scared. But it was scary because I kind of got whisked into the hospital. They were there waiting for me, right to the ICU. My blood sugar was so high that they couldn't even register it on their machine, their glucometer, and they had to do a blood draw.
Oh man.
And so, it was kind of a whirlwind of an experience, and it was a little bit overwhelming, but I think I actually did pretty well keeping it together because I had a little bit of a background for what this thing was. Not anywhere near what I could have imagined, but I knew, okay, I'm not dying. I just have to listen to what these people tell me and really attack this thing. And I, of course, had my family, they all came right there, and I was in the hospital for, I think, like 4 days, and they all stayed with me. So, scary, but, manageable. And then I would say for anyone else who's in this situation, you're probably going to feel the same way. You're going to be scared. I really hope you've got family with you because it is overwhelming. And I would just say that, there's so much information and there's so much knowledge you have to get. And it's kind of like someone who, as they get older through their career, they get more wise and they get smarter and they learn and they eventually kind of develop their skills and this crazy skill set that they might have by the end of their career. It's kind of the same thing with diabetes. Is you're not going to get everything right away. You're going to be frustrated. But if you continue to work with your healthcare team and, put a lot of effort in, it's totally manageable, and you just have to take little bit and little bit and little bit over the course of months and years. And eventually, it'll just become second nature. It's not easy. It'll never be easy, but you can be good at it. You can be skilled at managing it, even if it's not easy to do. And so there's definitely hope in that, even if it's scary.
One of the things that jumps out to me right away is that you're pretty inspirational. And so I only just say that because we've been over the screen for a few minutes, and I follow you on Instagram, which is always a nice way to share inspiration. I always, pay more attention to people who do that. But what I'm understanding is like you're a college freshman of some sort, right? Or, summer before, however that works, becoming an adult. How did it affect your educational experience? How did that, both from a health perspective and then, into your drive and desire, how did that work?
So that's an interesting question because it actually has almost everything to do with kind of who I am and where I'm headed. It was really hard. It was one of those things that really kind of shook up my whole, 4-year process in college. Because like I said, this is the kind of thing that takes years to develop the skills to be good at managing. And here I am going into college with not that time, under my belt, having to figure it out while also figuring out, hard stuff at school. I was managing 2 programs at once. So it really kind of hit me in a way that I'm not always good at noticing things as they're happening, but then reflecting back later, I'm like, oh, wow. Like, yeah, I was really struggling, and I just am like kind of a grinder. I just kind of push through and keep going. But I remember, I got to a point where I was kind of really struggling with being able to manage all the schoolwork and have focus on the exams and things when I'm trying to figure out, it's really hard to think clearly when your blood sugar is like maybe high or low. And I was in the middle of a 2-year-long battle with my insurance company because they wouldn't give me the supplies and the technology that I really needed at the time. So I was not, I didn't have the optimal resources either. So it was hard, and I didn't know how to talk about that with people. I didn't know how to tell people. I didn't know how to, communicate with my, college, with the professors and the school in terms of, getting me what I needed and everything. And I just kind of pushed through and barreled through. And looking back, I wish I would have taken the time to like really explain what was going on. And so, it really would have made my time a lot easier and a lot more manageable. But, I'm grateful that I went through that because I, in addition to doing research, as somebody who will eventually have a PhD in nursing, I'll be in a good position to become an educator too. And so I do see myself, along with doing research, being an educator, probably for, a researching institution, a college. And I can be one of those people that a student like me would have loved to have gone to and talked to, to help them through a process. And it doesn't have to be someone with type 1 diabetes, but someone with anything coming up and a little bit of compassion and perspective to kind of help with that. I think that is a motivator for me because I kind of went through that.
I think it's interesting the way that you answered that question, which was really great. By the way, I commend it. I think that it didn't occur to me until then about we often talk about on the show how mental illness is an ongoing thing with which the person who's affected by the mental illness has to do that, right? And then, you were talking a bit about how great your family is as, people who are around you, especially when you're like diagnosed with such a thing and working through that stuff. But it does for something that's, a non-terminal, but certainly lifelong condition. It does become a situation where you have to learn probably to self-balance in between the kind of the mental part of managing something as well as the clinical part, right? Because I think a lot of times the family, it's easy to, and I don't know your family, and I certainly am not encouraging you to put your family on blast on a podcast, by the way. But it's easier for a family to think, oh my gosh, she's out of, whatever clinical ER danger that there is. And now she's good because she has this thing that a bunch of other people have and how we work on that. And I know that's a big part of your life today is to help bridge those gaps. So what would you say to a family? Or also to the person, because you just gave some advice to yourself, right? I wish I would have reached out a little bit more and kind of talked about what I was going through. So for somebody who has a good family and who has some people around them who's dealing with not just diabetes, but let's say a long-term illness in this way, what advice would you give them? And why would you give them that advice? I think because that's what people want to know outside of just advice. There's plenty of effing advice, right?
Yeah.
Why would you give that advice,
Well, diabetes particularly, I know you mentioned, really anyone with any different kind of condition, but okay, we'll just say medical conditions in general. First and foremost, the family or the supporters, maybe it's even just a close friend or a partner or something, they have to understand the clinical portion of it, as you kind of alluded to earlier, because there is potential for risks and for scary things to happen. And so you just want to have some people who know what to do in case something happens. So that's kind of, I think, goes without saying, is people should be willing to learn a little bit about what they need to do in the event of something happening. But then, much more beyond that, it's just it is sometimes very overwhelming, especially when you are someone like me who wants to try to maintain the most normal, quote unquote normal, because that's kind of like a social construct. The most the life as close as you could to someone who doesn't have that, disease.
Yeah.
You want to try to strive for that. And so that's not always easy to do. And it's, definitely kind of a daunting task. So, as you are working through that and you're working hard and you're also doing that on top of managing school, work, particularly if your work is stressful or your school is stressful. Maybe you have other responsibilities, like you're a caretaker for somebody else or you're a parent and you have other things, it's hard to fit all that in together. So definitely social circles around people with illness, they need to be willing to kind of step in and say, I might not know what you're going through, but if you need something, I can do whatever I can do. I can make you a dinner one night. I can just listen to you. Maybe I don't know what you're saying, but if you just listen for an hour to someone rant, it can be very helpful, even if they don't even contribute to the conversation. Just a social support, I don't think that's really any novel idea. Just offer your support in any way that you can, whatever is sustainable for you. Because, it's not something that goes away. People living with chronic illnesses, it doesn't go away and they don't get a break. And so sometimes it's nice if someone can just offer them anything close to a break for, even an hour.
Sure.
Well, you talked about social circles, and in doing some research, I found out that there's a diabetes camp. Well, there's several actually, and you were part of one, right? Is it Camp Ho Dakota? Did I say that right?
Yes, you
Tell
did
us about
actually.
that. Tell us about that
Camp Ho
experience.
Dakota. Oh, it's a wonderful place. It really is. And I learned about it a few years ago, more than a few years ago, back when I was in college. See, that beep is my pump going off. And I learned about it through my little diabetes social circle. I made some diabetes friends because I recognized that I needed some people who really understood what I was going through. Family's great, but they don't get it because they don't know. You need people who really can relate. So in addition to your family or your friends, find a couple, this is more advice, find a couple, other people who can relate on a more specific level, who have it, or maybe a parent of someone who has it. Anyway, so I have this really good girlfriend who is just amazing, and she's also doing type 1 diabetes research, got her PhD. Shout out, Julia. And she told me about camp. So camp is like this wonderful place. It's here in Ohio, and it is they're kind of rebranding a little bit to incorporate anyone who wants to come, but historically it has been a place specifically for children with diabetes, recognizing that kids with diabetes don't always feel like everybody else. They feel kind of out of the box. They are sometimes a little bit limited in that maybe if they're trying to play with their friends and they have a low blood sugar and they have to stop, or they're embarrassed because you're a teenager and you have body image, concerns, but you have a thing connected to your body. You have a pancreas, a little bionic pancreas on the outside of your body. So this camp recognized that children with diabetes really have their own unique kind of problems and challenges. And so every summer they invite, all summer long, or at least for the bulk of it, children to come. They go to a camp, and it's a summer camp unlike anything I've ever seen. It's like basically an adventure camp. Kids can do rock climbing. They can do like axe throwing. They can do arts and crafts. They have movie nights. They do like kayaking and paintball, and like literally it's like every kid's like, it's just glorious for all of them. But we have doctors on staff, we have nurses on staff, we have everybody managing these kids' diabetes for them, or at least helping them transition, and maybe if they're in the in-between stage. So it's helpful for the families too, because the parents need a break. Sometimes parents are like, just as much as I'm exhausted having to self-manage it, if I were a parent who's having to self-manage it for a little child, but also having to be a mom for other children and working and all that, they need a break. And so it's nice for them to send their kids to camp knowing, rest assured, we can take care of it and let that kid feel normal and have fun. And so I worked as a dispensary nurse there for 2 summers straight. I took time off from my actual work, like a vacation time, and then spent my vacation time working at the children's camp there as their nurse, which is really fun. You get to learn so much. And it's actually, interesting for me because I wasn't a child with diabetes. I never had that experience. I got it when I was 17. So I actually learned a lot from the kids because I'm watching them experience it at a different age. And now I have a little bit of a different role. It's harder for me to take time off of work to go do that. So I am part of their medical committee, and we had like a COVID task force where we had to figure out how to prepare camp so that the kids could still come during COVID. And we were like the only one in Ohio that figured out how to do it. And we did it successfully so that the kids could still come to camp during this whole pandemic. So I do kind of some more like back in the background stuff now, which is actually, it's just as, I think, fulfilling for me.
Sure. Well, I don't want to put advice in your mouth, but we always want our experts, like very clearly you are, to give some advice. But like, I think about, was getting involved young with something like that as like a volunteer, does that give you the opportunity now? And would that be some advice you might give to somebody who's thinking about what they do with their extra time right now, so that now as like a grown adult, you're able to move into those like committee type positions with such a special thing?
No, I think that's actually kind of spot on. I'm always a little bit someone that thinks kind of like 5 years ahead. So, if you are someone who wants to kind of be a change maker, or, someone who can make real progress, an advocate of sorts, you have to start somewhere, and definitely volunteering is a great place to do it. I actually was already, working in the hospital when Julia found me and kind of recruited me to come work at camp. So I actually didn't have to start off as a volunteer. I got paid from the get-go. But they do have actually a program set up just with that in mind, where they take campers and they pick kind of the ones who really exemplify the skills and the qualities that they, like to see in people. Mm-hmm. And they put them through a program where they can become a counselor in training, so that they can be, kind of like the counselors of the camp. And then from there, they can kind of work up. And eventually you'll see a lot of people who work campers start to kind of like volunteer, and then they'll start working as a counselor. And then they start, one of the campers actually became like a director of sorts for the camp. So they actually build that into their program, which I think is really cool.
Wow, that's amazing. My sister's special education educator, and she has like a little bit of a similar relationship. And quite frankly, I think like a similar struggle maybe hasn't worked out as well from like the committee thing, as she like has her own kids and stuff. But she, has some parts in a camp not too far north. Where in Ohio are you?
I'm actually in North Homestead. I'm pretty close to Cleveland. Okay. But the camp is not. The camp is in Auburn, Ohio, which is kind of out a little bit in the boonies, as they say.
Okay. Our listeners, like, this is honest truth, is Chris is going to take off here. He's going to do some stuff with the sun. But we get some feedback from our listeners that we always talk about Metro Detroit. So since I knew you were from Ohio, I was going to get some shout outs to some other lands, people from Ohio always say that it's rural, or like more rural than I experience it being, y'all give yourself a hard time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it really depends on where you are. I have been living in the suburbs of Cleveland my whole life, and I went to college in Cleveland. So I am very familiar with the kind of city part of it, but there definitely is. Anytime you meet someone from out of state, they're like, "Oh, cornfields, Ohio," and I'm like, "No, but really, no. Like, there's plenty of places like that, but we have a mix, actually. I think, especially with Columbus and Cincinnati, we definitely have like those big city feels with their kind of suburbs around them, and then sure, you go out far enough and you have some wonderful woods and everything too."
I think Ohio is a cool place to visit too, especially where you're at. Did you know that show reviews help Mike and I appear higher on podcast searches inside of all the different channels that we appear upon? So by now we're past a couple thousand listens, but what we really want to try to do is turn the corner and increase the number of people who have a chance to hear conventioNOT. So if you haven't done so yet, take a second, go out to your podcast provider and give us a review. We really read the feedback, we really take it to heart, and we really appreciate you. Is it Case Western that you went to school?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. I've always fashioned Case Western as kind of like this graduated program. If we could just like turn a little bit away, are you like currently a PhD candidate, or is that your long-term goal? And is it you going to stick with Case from an educational perspective?
Yeah.
Tell people why Case, because every time I meet a Case Western graduate, I am impressed with like the alumnus and like the way that it works. I'd be excited to hear.
Well, Case is cool for a lot of reasons. I think one really attractive part about the college is that they are really well situated in a spot where there's a lot of really cool resources and institutions around, particularly for people, like myself who are interested in healthcare and research. We got major medical centers all around us, and places that, are doing research. And so it gets really easy to kind of A, be able to start research, or B, hop on other people's projects and get involved quickly in ways that might be really hard if you're out somewhere who doesn't have as strong connections to those types of places in their community like Case does. Case has a lot of community outreach and a lot of really strong community ties all around Cleveland. So they make that kind of easy for students to progress and level up, They definitely have a rigor about them. My program was very challenging. And so that, from that standpoint, I definitely was very, very, maybe even over prepared for my field. So I think people kind of recognize that, just the rigor is definitely helpful. And then I think a lot of other people find very attractive the fact that they seem to be, I think one of their taglines is kind of like about social justice. They care about that a lot too. So they're constantly involved in important conversations in the community and things like that regarding, social justice too. So
that's interesting. You know what? Something that we could talk about, because I'm aware of some of that Case. We have a lot of friends that are from your area. My wife went to Kent State with Chris, actually. And so everybody talks about Ohio as a rural perspective. If they really looked into Ohio, like both currently with some of the social justice perspective from like a school, I did a little bit of homework about Case Western before we started, but also just like the history with like the Kent State stuff and all that kind of stuff. Maybe they could think less about cornfields and a little bit more of like how Ohio represents America in a lot of ways, My Michigan fan, I'm not a Michigan fan at all. Brethren are probably like, peeling their maize and blue shirts off right now, but that's how I feel. I want to be honest with you. I think Ohio is representative of a lot. So,
I think I would agree.
Could I ask you another question? I know I'm kind of like pulling you across subjects here, but one of the things that struck me pretty interesting is that you mentioned that you like to plan 5 years out. Okay, and I'm sure that this time, and we're recording this late 2020. It's November 2020. You've now been working in this intense environment with COVID for so long. Okay. And so I'm not going to ask you, if you want to give some advice as to what people should be doing right now, that's great. But this show's kind of episodic, right? And so what I would like you to say is like, what happens 5 years from now and kind of like the treatment of the way that we do stuff like this, right? Whether you want to speak about exactly this type of a thing, but, more importantly, like how 5 years from now do you see your career changing in the environment that you work in currently, like in the intensive care unit, and how that works?
Okay, so, a couple of things. In 5 years, I will not be in the intensive care environment anymore.
I know that.
So,
but clearly you're insightful.
Yeah. Well, what I will say about this whole process is that whether people were ready for it or not, COVID-19 kind of forced everyone to adapt quickly and innovate, I would say.
Mhm.
So, to speak on the ICU perspective, we had to come up with kind of novel ways to try to treat really sick patients while minimizing contact with them and reducing, the possibility of spreading it to other really sick patients who are in the same space in
Mhm.
close proximity. So, I think something that we learned from this is that nurses, doctors, all different types of people, product developers came up with lots of really unique solutions to help solve some of these problems. And we learned that you can do it and you can do it really fast. And so I think going forward, people are going to take with them the memory of, well, when push comes to shove, we can innovate and we can innovate quickly. So like something I'm thinking of off the top of my head, is that people with COVID-19, you want to minimize your contact. You don't want to spread to other people. So you keep their room doors closed if you can. But then there are people who are on ventilators. They might be on dialysis machines working for their kidneys. They might have 6 different IV drips going because they're really sick and they need to have sedation going and they need to have meds for their blood pressure to keep them up. And they also, they might have like 5 different machines in the room that as a nurse you have to manage. So simple things people came up with was like people developed like extension ways to extend these machines to be able to come out of the room into the hallway so that could be programmed and worked from the hallway remotely. There was a lot of work on remote technology and extending things to like, make sure distance was there. So some of the best things were the ones that could be done wirelessly. So I think it's going to push people to be wireless. It's going to push people to be more remote if they need to be. And that kind of translates out of the healthcare world just in general too. We've seen that now people can work from home very effectively in a lot of roles. They don't really need the office space that traditionally we've forced people to go to in a 9-to-5 kind of job. Technologies are kind of like really being utilized, much more than they were. And I think people are going to be demanding now more than ever that we move away from this kind of old model of working, in person when we have lives to do and we maybe could do it from home or whatever. So I don't know if that was even what you're asking, but that's just what popped into my head.
No, that's exactly what I'm asking because, so often and like people, our listeners are probably rolling their eyes, a little bit when I say this, not when you were talking, but how many conversations about COVID don't have to do with somebody who's had like some real experience with like some clinical perspective. And so for me, I was just curious as to how you would answer that. Because it's cool to speculate. And this is going to be something that we look back on, in the same way that we look back on 9/11. And I don't want to like politically compare those things, but I do want to compare about the way that those shape the way that we educate ourselves, the way that kids go to school and choose their majors and all those kinds of things. And I think you touched on it, right? Like you talked about technology being kind of like part of maybe, if I heard you correctly, helping I'm going to choose the marketing word, so forgive me, helping the essential worker work a little bit more intelligently with the traditional devices that have been traditionally in the hospital room. But now a lot of those devices are now providing like reporting and they're able to be controlled remotely. So, 5 years from now, I hope we still know each other. We'll probably still be doing the show. We're just about to come up on 2 years. So maybe this will happen.
Congratulations.
But I really appreciate your perspective today. It's phenomenal. I fear we're coming toward the end of the episode. But is there anything that I didn't ask you? I never ask a listener this, but as Chris departed, it's just you and I here, is there anything that I never asked you that something you might like to share with our guests today, that is important regarding what we've talked about, healthcare, management of, long-term conditions or diabetes specifically?
Yeah, I guess something I spend a lot of time thinking about, being a person who works in healthcare and also someone who relies heavily as a patient with a chronic disease. I really hope that we continue as a society to move more towards the patient-centered model of healthcare as we are trying to. And in some places that is, not necessarily, we're not really hitting the marks yet. And particularly with type 1 diabetes, there's a lot of work to do there. And so I guess I would just encourage anyone who might know somebody with diabetes, if they hear this, or is a diabetic themselves, that you really have the power to choose your provider and to be highly involved in your care and to drive your care. And because the care is really not equal depending on where you go, depending on the level of expertise that the person has, depending on the availability of the resources. I'm lucky enough to be able to have the technology that I need. But at one time I mentioned I was in a fight with my insurance company who wouldn't give it to me. So not everyone's on the same playing field. And I just want to encourage people to try the best that they can to fight to be their own advocate, because it's really not easy to do. I know that from personal experience, especially in these kind of hard times where people are very stressed out, and sometimes people aren't even wanting to do in-person visits. So
Sure.
it's a random thought tacked on, but I think that's important for people to remember, is that you can really ultimately drive your own care, and you have the right to do that, and you absolutely should.
I think that's really good advice, right? So I know both of us want to be kind of conscious of like what our employers are, but like our listeners know that I work on some of the other sides of, diabetic management. Most of what we do is not pharmaceutical, so it doesn't have to do with the some of the pumps it does have to do with, but not so much of the delivery of the insulin like what Jorden talked about. But one of the things that I would say, if I could kind of plead for that side of the supplies that it takes to treat long-term illness, whether it be, diabetic specifically, or some other longer term illnesses that require upkeep, supply, as well as meds, is that the provider of those meds, number one, you can change that provider of meds. I'm not even going to give you an advertisement for my company about what I try to affect every day, because that's not what this show is about. But number two, I think that the best patients are the educated patients, like what you said, because you have to turn your provider into an advocate. The insurance component of it is something that the person who provides that care, whether it be face-to-face from a physician care perspective, or whether it be like the supplies and the pharmacy component of it, no is not like something that you can always accept from an insurance company. And so when you get your care provider and when you get the medication provider or the, replenishable supplies providers involved together, it's almost always the patient that does that. It's rarely that like one physician reaches out to somebody else to help you out these days. I wish it weren't that way, to be honest with you. But it's not anymore. I think at one point in time it was that, but quite frankly, cutbacks, I think, is what caused it to start to be that way. But I think there's opportunity as a patient too.
Yeah, for sure. There definitely is.
All right. Well, listen, we've been at this almost an hour. I appreciate you taking this time with us today. Could you give us like a few little plugs? I know you had a friend there. You shouted out like her first name if you want to shout her out a little better, but for sure, like the camp, let us know like how to get in touch with the camp, whether I want to donate to that camp, I want to investigate it. Let us know how to follow you or follow your organizations that you're involved with. I really appreciate this in-depth chat today. Thanks for being vulnerable with us. It's cool.
Of course. You want me to kind of say some of that stuff out loud, or you just want to leave it in your show notes?
No, I wanted you to say it out loud because nobody ever really reads the show notes anyway. They just listen.
That's true. That's fair.
Yeah.
Not true for you. I'm just saying in general.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the camp that I talked about is Camp Homita Coda. They have a website and they also have an Instagram. It's HOMITA KODA. Really, really great place for kids with type 1 diabetes, or maybe not, someone without it. I am on Instagram. I am Jorden_Rieke, JORDEN_Rieke, RIEKE. And I have kind of like a wellness blog that I started a couple years ago just as like a cathartic, honestly, like experience for me, like a reflection tool. And that's just working.on.wellness. So you can find me there. I post a lot of like fitness stuff because it's really important to my management of my disease and just my wellness in general. I think that's pretty much it, honestly.
Shout out, be one of the great ones. I can tell like you are working on your game to be one of the great ones. And I really mean this. I don't care if we're recording or not. Like I can tell it's like in you. And so like that makes me really excited for what's to come for the future. We often do these kind of like re-invite shows. I would love to invite you back. So, you know, some of the episodes, we did a re-invite show about men's underwear. We did one about video games.
I listened to that one.
Yeah. So even though it might sound funny, like we're starting to try to like, you know, build this like consistent group of listenership. And so I would be excited to invite you back. Both fitness and science are two of the like core values of the program. And so we don't get too, you know, formal on that. This isn't like, you know, a motivational speech from that perspective, you know, long form content, like you mentioned, like a blog. And I think finding experts on stuff that you could trust and listen to, you know, people who contribute to the world because they know stuff is kind of hard to find. So we probably won't see you on like one of those news channels anytime soon. I'd rather see you back on conventioNOT.
Yeah, I would love to come back.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, let me give, you know, everybody who's not already following us out on the gram, come on in and, you know, follow the show. It's at conventioNOT_podcast. We serve up the show on any channel whatsoever. I think we just went live on Amazon actually. So our listeners can find us on Amazon now. So I really, really appreciate you joining today. Thanks, Jorden.
Yeah, thanks for having me.